I think people underestimate the impact that muscle mass itself has on the way that they look, and especially the way that they feel and function in life. For some people that I work with, they have almost no worry about what they look like in a sense, but rather they want to be more functional in their everyday life. They want to feel better. And then a lot of people that I work with want to simply just look better. And with looking better oftentimes comes feeling better, but not always. So the impact that muscle has on people's physiques and how they function in their day-to-day life is kind of underestimated and undervalued a lot of times on social media. So I think, but in order to build muscle, we can't consistently be in a large caloric deficit, and exercise to a point becomes excessive. 10 sets of an exercise may not be as good as 15 sets of an exercise over a week, or 50 sets for a muscle group over a week. But 30 sets be less beneficial than 15 sets if all 30 sets are at a sufficient intensity. That's because there's a point in which we simply cannot recover, the muscle cannot recover from a given load that it is provided. And there's a lot of misinformation about how muscle growth works, but the process of muscle growth isn't breaking down a muscle and building it back up. That's simply just a misrepresentation of how muscle growth works. In fact, the process of tearing down a muscle fiber is actually counterintuitive when it comes to trying to build muscle. So although we want to have some sort of stimulus for muscle growth, we're not actually trying to destroy the muscle. Or, at a cellular level, we're not trying to actually tear it down, because that ends up being incongruent with our goals of building as much muscle as possible. So I think people think that the more exercise that they do, oftentimes will lead them to better results, whether it's more cardio, more resistance training, more frequency, things like that. But in reality, there's a U-shaped curve for essentially anything, where there's some results as you get higher and higher, and then once you surpass a specific threshold, the results actually begin to deteriorate. So I think trying to find that with exercise, and also trying to find that with caloric intake, is important, because if we are radically over-exercising and radically under-eating, not only will we be losing muscle, but the percentage of weight that we lose will be in a greater extent muscle than fat. So if I lose 20 pounds in 10 months and you lose 20 pounds in 1 month, the percentage of weight that I lose that comes from fat may end up being greater, and I might lose less muscle mass simply because I took a longer time to do so, and I didn't put myself into such a caloric deficit. So there's people think the faster and the more rigorous they do things, oftentimes the better results that they will get. But sometimes simply taking it slower and doing a little bit less may actually lead you to better results in the long term.
Hello, and welcome to 100% Real with Ruby. Today, I am so excited to have Calvin on. Calvin Scheller is someone who has kind of had this huge upswing in his massive talking of hormones and how it impacts. I'm just gonna say we're gonna try to simplify it, but we're gonna talk about how it impacts your ability to get or not to get results, in the sense of what are you actually believing, what's true, what isn't true, and insulin resistance, carbs, cortisol, even GLP-1s. They're all becoming this huge talked about, I don't want to say trend, I'm just going to say topics. And one thing that Calvin mentioned, one word that Calvin mentioned before I clicked record, is the word inflammation. And if you zoom out, having a healthy, focused lifestyle on eating a wholesome diet, mostly whole foods, moving often, sleeping, all of these things are exactly what helps put you into this healthy state. It's just most of us aren't kind of following the guidelines. But with all that aside, here's Calvin. I'm going to let him introduce himself and the topic of insulin resistance, improving insulin sensitivity, and where carbs, cortisol, GLP-1s, where all of that fits into the equation.
Yeah, so my name's Calvin Scheller. So I'm 19. I live in kind of a small town in North Carolina in the middle of nowhere. And I kind of got into health and nutrition and publishing on social media when I was younger. So I developed an autoimmune condition when I was younger, IBD, which kind of left me unable to eat for a while. And I lost a ton of weight. I ended up in the hospital, in and out of doctor's offices and hospitals for most of high school. And I kind of just had extra free time, and I just couldn't stand not understanding what was going on. So I decided to try and figure it out. So I just kind of started reading. For probably 2 or 3 years, I simply just consumed content for as much time of the day as I could, which oftentimes was hours. And then at the end of high school, I decided to start publishing some content on social media, and it got some popularity. I'll say I'm not too proud of the things that I said and things I believed right at the beginning, kind of some of the things that are perpetuated on social media at the moment that some of my recent videos try to kind of combat or correct in a sense. That's kind of the things that I believed right off the bat. I started social media and didn't quite know what I was doing. And as I grow over the years and learn that changing your opinion is part of the process, I try and produce as much content as I can. So lately, I've been on a few podcasts and publishing articles a lot recently. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. I publish a lot on social media, and write some articles for some people I looked up to when I was.
Yeah, that's where I came across you as well. You wrote for Alan Aragon's research review, and the one that I liked the most was the piece on, obviously, the insulin part, because I feel like that's the most misunderstood thing. And just as you were saying before we clicked record, a lot of people are scared of insulin, like it's the demon hormone, but then they take GLP-1s. And what does that do? That actually increases the insulin response. Well, it increases the insulin because what does insulin do? It also gives us the feelings of satiety, which helps us stay full. And then diabetics, they need to inject insulin to help with their blood sugar levels. So it's not really this demon hormone. And then there's cortisol, which is also given the same bad rap. So I don't know where you want to start the conversation so we can kind of elucidate what exactly it is insulin does, why it is so important, but where along the line insulin resistance becomes this thing that we need to start to address and how we can start to address it. But also realizing that insulin resistance doesn't make fat loss this impossible thing for us. And we don't really need to follow all of these like protocols for PCOS and protocols for whatever it is. It's basically the same stuff. It's just fabricated a different way just to try to get your money.
Yeah, so I guess probably the best place to start would be just an explanation of what insulin is. So insulin is a hormone that we produce after eating anything. So when fuels enter into our pancreas, specifically glucose, they can increase the production of energy inside of the pancreas. And this process concomitantly increases the release of insulin. So when insulin is released into the bloodstream, it binds to a receptor, which a lot of people don't realize is located on essentially every cell in our body, including the kidneys, the liver, the brain, the fat tissue, the muscle tissue. Every cell that you can think of has an insulin receptor. So one of the most important roles of insulin is to reduce the availability of circulating nutrients inside of the bloodstream. So when insulin binds to its receptor, it stimulates that specific cell to uptake all of the nutrients out of the bloodstream, including glucose, fatty acids. So diabetes is a condition that is characterized by having insulin resistance. So type 2 diabetes specifically. And the reason that these individuals have such elevated blood glucose is because when insulin is binding to its receptor cells, that cell isn't responding. So it's not uptaking nutrients out of the bloodstream. And the biggest indication of insulin resistance or of pre-diabetes diabetes is an elevated blood glucose. So we see that those individuals that come into the doctor's office that have chronically elevated blood glucose, which we have multiple different blood markers and biomarkers that we can look at, those individuals have insulin resistance because when insulin binds to its receptor, it doesn't function as it typically would. And I think, so we use glucose as a marker to diagnose insulin resistance because it's one of the most easily measured molecules in the bloodstream, and it fluctuates more heavily than most other molecules. So we see that when blood glucose is elevated, it's a sign of insulin resistance. So oftentimes that is inflated into thinking that every time we elevate our blood glucose, that leads to insulin resistance, that contributes to insulin resistance. So this is kind of somewhat of a misunderstanding of what actually causes insulin resistance or what we have shown to actually induce insulin resistance. So it's not necessarily the consumption of carbohydrates themselves that lead to insulin resistance. The issue is that when we begin to gain excess body fat, that fat begins to stay inside of cells with insulin receptors. And when those cells become overstuffed with fatty acids or adequate, when those cells become overfilled, those fatty acids can begin leaking into compartments of the cells where they're not supposed to be. And when those fatty acids leak into those compartments, this disrupts the insulin signaling process. A disrupted insulin signaling process is what we would refer to as insulin resistance. So we see that pretty much the wealth of data indicates that the two biggest risk factors for insulin resistance are excess body weight and physical inactivity. Excess body weight because we're simply storing too many fatty acids that we can utilize, and those fatty acids have a higher propensity to be contributing to by being in compartments of cells. And physical inactivity is a little bit different, but one and the same. So physical activity itself utilizes fatty acids. So when we are physically inactive, those fatty acids are not being utilized and they begin accumulating in specifically muscle cells. So we see that physical inactivity contributes to insulin resistance because the flux of fatty acids, which is the uptake and usage, decreases, meaning more fatty acids are available to disrupt the insulin signaling process.
Something that is really important that you just said there, and that's inactivity, because being active is something that there's this receptor called GLUT4. And when you move your body, you are opening up a different channel that does not rely on insulin to get whatever is circulating in your blood into the cells that need those fuels. And you mentioned this just then, where when insulin cannot get the blood glucose out of your bloodstream, that's when issues start to happen. That's when insulin resistance starts to occur, because it is the overabundance of too many. It's not just glucose. This is where I want you to talk about saturated fats as well. But like Calvin said, it is a whole heap of excess fuels circulating around our body. It becomes an inflammatory state. This is why moving is so important. This is why being in a healthy body fat range is so important. But I do want you to talk a little bit more about where saturated fats play a role in all of this, because I think people spend too much time demonizing carbs that they don't realize the impact of where fats fit into this equation, especially because fats usually just get stored as fat. Whereas there's like carbs, we need them for fuel. And if we can actually fuel our movement, so it's not just dormant in our bloodstream, that can actually serve a much higher end purpose.
Yeah, so as hopefully kind of as a simplified version, so we have saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. So saturated fatty acids means it's kind of a chemistry term in a sense, so that each of the bonds on acid has a carbon chain attached. So it's fully saturated, meaning there's no open bonds or there's no double bonds. And then an unsaturated fat is a little bit different. It doesn't have the adequate amount of carbons, so there's singular or double bonds or multiple double bonds inside of that fatty acid. Really, the big difference it makes is the structure of the fatty acid. So things high in unsaturated fatty acids are typically plant products, and things high in saturated fats are typically animal products, with the exception of things like coconut oil and avocado oil. So saturated fats, when we consume them, they do a few things that can alter insulin sensitivity in a negative way. The first is that we see that of all the saturated fatty acids, despite what is said along social media, saturated fats do have a mild inflammatory effect. So we see that when saturated fats are consumed, they lead to the greatest increase of what are called lipopolysaccharides into the bloodstream. These are basically just gram-negative bacteria that sit inside of the gastrointestinal tract that can come into the bloodstream as we digest food. And it appears that saturated fats induce the largest increase in serum lipopolysaccharides. So and when these are in the bloodstream, they can induce an inflammatory response. And in addition, there are saturated fats that can activate inflammatory receptors or bind to receptors that increase the production of these inflammatory cytokines. And we didn't talk about it much, but inflammatory cytokines are quite important when it comes to insulin resistance. So when we have these cytokines floating around in the bloodstream, they can, in a sense, permeate cells. And when they permeate cells that contain insulin receptors, specific inflammatory cytokines that are upregulated after a consumption of saturated fats, they can bind to specific proteins in the insulin receptor and once again induce insulin resistance. So we see that increased inflammation is associated with increased insulin resistance. And if we modulate the inflammatory cytokines within the bloodstream, we can modulate insulin resistance. Again, it's mild. Some people get quite overzealous about being extremely pertinent about which macronutrients, which types of macronutrients they're consuming. I would say the effects of saturated fats come far below the effects of body fat and physical activity. But there is a mild inflammatory effect of saturated fats that can acutely and temporarily reduce insulin sensitivity. And if you're eating a very high saturated fat diet on a daily basis, this is kind of prolonging that acute inflammatory response. And the other thing that saturated fats can do, especially, well, almost entirely when they are in an overfeeding sense. So saturated fats, if in a caloric deficit, aren't as metabolically impactful as saturated fats when we are in a caloric surplus, because those saturated fats have a greater propensity to store as fat in a location of the cell that we don't want it to be. So if we overfeed individuals on unsaturated fats, carbohydrates, or saturated fats, we see that the saturated fats both induce the greatest increase in liver fat content and appear to reduce insulin sensitivity to the greatest extent. There's a few reasons for this, probably the most impactful being the fact that the human body preferentially oxidizes or burns specific fatty acids. So it will oxidize or burn before it burns saturated fats. So when we ingest a meal containing saturated fats and essentially any other macronutrient, those saturated fats have a greater propensity to be stored inside of cells and used at a later date. And this in and of itself can acutely and in the long term contribute to insulin resistance. But again, I think, as I want to caveat as much as I can, the impact of saturated fats, especially in a caloric deficit, are very, very minimal. And the impact of saturated fats compared to excess body weight and physical inactivity, again, are quite small in relative terms.
There's something important that you said there. I really want this podcast to be something that educates my audience on why this stuff matters so much. What else increases inflammation here, and how can we help to buffer it? Because something you mentioned was the liver. The liver is needed to process most things, and this is where we need to be a lot more mindful about. If you're eating this high saturated fat diet, or even just in a higher body fat state. And then there's alcohol also coming in. There's so many different things that your liver here is needing to juggle. And that is, I would say, increasing the barrier for you to get into a more insulin sensitive state. I want you to talk a little bit more about that inflammation part on what actually helps to buffer it. Where does muscle and physical activity fit into this?
Yeah, so I guess probably one of the most potent stimulators of inflammation in the average American is excess body fat. So as our fat tissue expands, the blood vessels become further away from the fat tissue, which induces an inflammatory response directly in that fat tissue. And then the fat tissue itself can produce cytokines or produce molecules that also have an inflammatory effect. One specifically being leptin, which a lot of people see as an appetite suppressing hormone, but it also has an inflammatory effect. And the production of leptin increases as our adipose tissue expands. So we see that adipose tissue is probably one of the biggest contributors to all cause or systemic inflammation. We also see that an inability to get both high quality and efficient sleep increases the production of those inflammatory cytokines. So when we are not sleeping enough, there's a kind of a hormonal milieu that will increase the production of specific inflammatory molecules. And then I guess it's interesting. So the muscle produces also inflammatory cytokines, but when the muscle produces inflammatory molecules, we call them myokines. And these myokines are essentially the exact same molecule as the cytokines produced by immune cells. However, myokines typically have the opposite effect as cytokines. So myokines have an anti-inflammatory effect, and oftentimes they have different effects that improve health rather than impair health. So it can be the exact same molecule, but oftentimes they are either working through a different metabolic pathway or they are binding to a different set of receptors in the same pathway, if that makes sense. So exercise itself, although there's a short-term production of what we would refer to as cytokines, we see in the long term there's a pretty drastic anti-inflammatory effect of exercise. And then kind of the next best step would be there are multiple dietary components that decrease inflammation. Most of which come from colorful fruits and vegetables. Some of them come from animal products as well, kind of the omega-3 fatty acids, and then the antioxidants and specific polyphenols found in fruits and vegetables and other plant products, including roots and tubers. So kind of an overall diet that is centered around whole foods appears to be probably the most potent dietary factor to reduce inflammation, is pretty much trying to make your diet as colorful as possible and trying to eat as many whole foods and single ingredient foods as you can.
This is why I say make your plates as colorful as you can. It's about plants and, well, I like to say it's about protein and color and movement, obviously. But I love this. So talk to me more about leptin, because this will also be where GLP-1s kind of come into the appetite equation. But with leptin, people would usually think that, okay, well, if body fat increases leptin, why am I still not completely full? And then there's also the physical activity component of appetite regulation. But leptin, inflammation, talk to me more about that.
Yeah, so leptin is a molecule secreted by fat tissue. And the larger your fat tissue gets, the more leptin it produces. And leptin has a few different effects throughout the human body, but probably the most important effect is that it binds to receptors in the brain that reduce appetite. So if we think about this logically, the more leptin we produce, the lower our appetite should be, which means people that have more body fat that produce more leptin should have the lowest appetites. However, we see kind of a U curve between the production of leptin and appetite control. That is, in the initial stages, too low of leptin increases appetite. But as we increase leptin, we see a reduction in appetite. And then there's kind of a plateau point where more leptin doesn't appear to have any more appetite suppressant effect. And once we reach that plateau, there's a bit of a downfall. That is, the people that produce more and more leptin have worse and worse appetite control. And the reason is because leptin exerts what is considered a homologous desensitization. That's just a fancy way of saying that the more leptin you produce, the less sensitive that your brain becomes to that leptin, which means that people who are producing large amounts of leptin, who are obese, have excess body fat, are becoming more and more leptin resistant. So they are unable to have the appetite suppressant effects of leptin, so that their appetite begins to be just as ravenous as someone who is at extremely low body fats and isn't producing much leptin in the first place.
Talking on the appetite regulation, what role does GLP-1 play in appetite regulation and energy balance, and why has it become such a hot topic in weight management? And I kind of don't want people to go away from this thinking, okay, I need to get GLP-1, because it does come with some negative consequences, and it does come with a huge financial burden, and it does come with the fact that as soon as you get off the thing, everything could end up worse, because it's almost like you add something into the system, you adapt to that thing, And as soon as you remove it, it's almost like the contrast is so much worse than how it was beforehand. And yeah, I just want to throw that out to you there.
Yeah, so GLP-1 is another molecule. It's considered an incretin. So GLP-1 is produced inside of the gastrointestinal tract. So GLP-1 is produced in response to the ingestion of food, which is important because we can modulate the production of GLP-1 via modulating our dietary factors. So when we ingest food, specific molecules inside of that food stimulate the cells that produce GLP-1 to release GLP-1 into the bloodstream. And GLP-1 has a very, very similar effect as leptin, as it binds to receptors within the brain and can suppress appetite. But it doesn't appear to exert the same homologous desensitization. That is, the more GLP-1 that we have in our system, we don't appear to become less and less sensitive to GLP-1. So we produce GLP-1 in response to food intake, and when this was kind of discovered, first molecules were considered molecules that increased the half-life of the GLP-1 we naturally produced. They were called DPP-4 inhibitors. So they basically took the GLP-1 that we produced after consuming food, and they increased the time that it spent inside of our bloodstream, having an effect. So it would increase our satiety after a meal. It would prolong the length of that satiety. And then as these molecules began showing efficacy, we began producing molecules that don't just increase the half-life of the GLP-1 we naturally produce, but can bind to the same receptors as the GLP-1 we produce and activate them. These are considered GLP-1 receptor agonists. They're completely separate molecules in GLP-1, but they bind to the GLP-1 receptor and activate it, in a similar sense to as if we were basically injecting GLP-1 into our bloodstream. So these medications were originally developed for diabetes. And the reason for this is because GLP-1 has quite a potent effect at decreasing blood glucose and improving diabetes for a multitude of reasons. And then we saw weight loss with these medications, and they began being marketed more and more toward weight loss, and we began coming out with different versions of GLP-1 receptor agonists at higher doses or combined with other medications that can decrease body weight. So they were originally designed for diabetes, and then they began being basically broadcasted for weight loss in the whole.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of people misunderstand this topic, and this is why people then just jump to the GLP-1s thinking that it's this cure or treatment. I really wanted to just go back to the concept of leptin, insulin resistance, and its interplay with chronic stress. I know I'm jumping back again, but I feel like this is really important because this insulin resistance thing is what a lot of people put down to this as why I can't lose weight. And then when the GLP-1s come in, it's allowing you to reduce your caloric intake, which is what we mentioned at the start of the podcast, which is what increases inflammation and thus insulin resistance. And where carbs fit into this, because I still feel like carbs are still demonized as the thing that makes the cascade of these hormones, this weight gain, this frustration with weight loss, a huge thing.
Yeah, so I guess we see that when we have physical and psychological stress, we increase the production of specific molecules, including adrenaline and cortisol. So cortisol is considered a glucocorticoid, which means it will bind to receptors and increase that specific cell's release of glucose, and it will increase the creation of glucose by the liver. But one thing that many people don't realize is that cortisol will also increase the availability of free fatty acids within the bloodstream. And these free fatty acids when cortisol is elevated and we see a large release in free fatty acids, it has a very similar effect as if we just consumed a bolus of dietary fat, because these free fatty acids can basically enter into cells and have the same effect as a high saturated fat meal, in which these fatty acids can alter the functioning of that insulin receptor and acutely induce insulin resistance. So elevated cortisol oftentimes cortisol is misrepresented as an inflammatory molecule. People don't realize that it's actually an anti-inflammatory molecule. That is, that we give people with injuries cortisone shots, which are basically the injectable version of cortisol. And in that area, it will decrease inflammation, because cortisol is not the cause of stress or the cause of inflammation. Rather, it's a response to stress and a response to inflammation. So cortisol's main role is to dampen down stress and to dampen down inflammation. But one of the ways that it does this is by increasing the fuel availability in the bloodstream. And when that happens, it will acutely reduce insulin sensitivity by increasing the availability of those fatty acids. So multiple things in life increase cortisol: psychological stress, sleep loss, things like a tooth infection can increase both inflammatory cytokines and cortisol production. And then there's a lot of dietary factors. As you mentioned, carbohydrates appear to it's not necessarily that a low carbohydrate diet radically increases cortisol production, but it's that carbohydrate consumption one of the mechanisms that people don't quite realize is that one of the ways that it does this is by increasing insulin production, because insulin itself has an anti-cortisol effect. That is, it can bind to the cells that produce or release cortisol. So carbohydrate consumption. So if we take an individual who just went through a rigorous workout, if we see an individual that ate no carbohydrates versus that ate a bolus of 60 grams of carbohydrates, the individual that ate 60 grams of carbohydrates will have a much lower and a much shorter and less prolonged cortisol response to that exercise session. Does that make sense?
I actually was just about to ask you about that one because I feel like this is so overlooked with. I'm talking about the general woman listening to this who has a busy lifestyle, who has a high stress lifestyle. If you're going to increase your, I'm just going to say, if you're going to increase your cortisol response because you do a hard workout or a cardio session or whatever it is, and then you don't recover from that, or you're on a low carb diet and you're going through your high stress day, I would essentially say you're dumping, I don't want to say dumping cortisol. Well, you're dumping glucose into your bloodstream because that's exactly what cortisol does. Cortisol frees up the carbs that are stored in your body, the fats that are stored in your body, but except you won't really be freeing up the fats because you're in this go, 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 and it's going to be mostly carbs if you're in that high stress lifestyle because it's fight or flight. If then at the end of the night, you're finally settling down, what goes up must come down. I really want you to explain this because it's going to be so powerful. But what goes up must come down. So all of this glycogen in the blood, carbs in the blood, I should say glucose in the blood, all of this glucose in the blood, all of this fuel that's circulating because you've been go, go, go all day, you haven't really given yourself a chance to come down. So now you're wondering why when you have a huge dinner meal, you're still a ravenous lion. Like your belly's full, you should be full, you had this huge meal, but you're still not satisfied. And now you're having some cravings. Explain to me that phenomenon.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So cortisol itself has an appetite stimulating effect within the brain, but the effects of cortisol also have an appetite stimulating effect. So people don't realize that insulin is considered an anorexigenic molecule, meaning that when insulin binds to receptors in the brain, it will suppress appetite and reduce food intake. So we see that increased production of cortisol, or when there's an elevation of cortisol in the bloodstream, there's a reduction in insulin sensitivity and leptin sensitivity. We also see that cortisol itself can stimulate appetite. So there's three mechanisms and a multitude of other mechanisms, all that coincide to basically increase appetite. And oftentimes appetite is misrepresented as a ravenous hunger, but sometimes for a lot of people, they may experience that appetite is not necessarily being extremely hungry, but feeling an inability to feel satiated. So you're eating, maybe you had a large meal, but you still don't feel quite satiated as you think that you should. That plays a large role in appetite. Whether or not you feel like you're really, really hungry, or you just simply cannot satiate the small amount of hunger that you do have. So there's multiple mechanisms by which cortisol can have an appetite increasing effect, but it appears that, so this one's a little tough to explain. So we see that in response to stress, the initial step is actually a different molecule is produced by the brain called CRH. And that molecule then stimulates the production of a secondary molecule called ACTH. And then finally, that molecule stimulates cortisol production. So the two prior molecules to cortisol production, CRH and ACTH, they actually have an appetite suppressant effect. So the beginning stages of the stress response, or in response to the initial stressor, there's actually a reduction in appetite. However, once that process has begun to subside and we see an altered ratio of cortisol to those other molecules in the bloodstream, in which cortisol begins to increase and they begin to decrease, that's when the appetite stimulating effects begin to come into play. So during the day, we might have a high stress day. And it's during this time that our appetite is actually suppressed because there's molecules in the bloodstream that are suppressing it. And we're kind of focused on a multitude of other things. And then once that stress begins to wear off, or once we begin to wind down for the day, the ratio of appetite stimulating and appetite suppressing molecules in the bloodstream begins to favor appetite stimulating molecules. And that's when we see kind of a ravenous hunger at the end of the day, or an inability to feel satiated. So it is almost as if the hunger is masked during the day by stress itself. And once that stress to subside, that's when we see a large increase in appetite.
I cannot understate the importance of managing your stress load in this. And I have seen you speak a little bit more on allostatic load. And I do want to bring into this sleep as well, because people just drastically, like our body's response, this isn't going off topic to what Calvin just said, because our response and our ability to handle these things, if we're not getting enough sleep, we have a lower ability to respond to these things. We have a lower ability to buffer these things. And then if you're also running on lower sleep, if you're also higher stressed, this isn't just a chemical thing that's going on in your body. Psychologically, I don't know whether it's something you can talk about, but I think this is going to resonate hard, because one study that I will always bring up over and over again is the mind over milkshake study, because it's one of the first ones that I read years ago. Our mindset has the power to shift hormones. And I don't mean like the hormones that people usually come to here, but like appetite hormones, the way that you respond to food. You can, like, this is why I don't like people focusing on you're in a diet, you're in a calorie deficit, because if you're thinking restriction all the time, you're going to be less full from any meal. It's why I like to think on performance, why I like to shift the focus away from weight loss. Stop focusing on weight loss. Just have your habits and your calories in check to lose weight, if that's what the goal is, but have the focus elsewhere so that you're not self-imposing your own hunger, your own struggles. But that aside, this is where a lot of the stress stuff comes in, a lot of the psychology stuff comes in, because if you're getting to the end of the day and you haven't addressed what's happening through the day, you're going to be in a more vulnerable place to then binge, to then overeat. And then that's going to start the self-perpetuating cycle that happens every single day, because then this leads into, but I always overeat at night. So I'm going to try to be really good during the day. I'm going to eat little during the day, but then you're just having exactly the same effect that what Calvin just described. So I kind of said a lot there. I want you to pick out what's important that you want to talk about, where the hormones fit in here, and where allostatic load can fit in here, and where psychology can fit in here, on how it all kind of weaves together. Because the overall theme that we want here is, how can we make these hormones our friends, and how can we get through the noise so that we can still get results without feeling like hormones need balancing, which they don't. Our lifestyle does.
Yeah, there is a lot to pick apart there. So I guess the study that you're talking about it was a fairly notable study. So it was titled quite funny, Mind Over Milkshakes. So it basically gave two sets of people the exact same shake. I believe it was a crossover design, meaning one group started with one shake and then they went to the other group and had the other shake. So the first group, mind you, these are the exact same shakes. Let's caveat that. So each person was given the exact same shake. However, they were either told that it was a sensible shake or an indulgent shake, meaning simply one shake would have higher calories and one shake would have lower calories. And they saw that those that were told that a sensible shake had more hunger after the matter, and those that were told it was an indulgent shake were less hungry and more satiated. But they also measured a specific molecule called ghrelin, which is a molecule produced in the gastrointestinal tract that stimulates appetite. And those that were given the sensible shake had a higher production of ghrelin, meaning that simply what they thought about the exact same shake altered their hormonal response to the ingestion of that shake, which in turn we saw altered their appetite. So there are psychological ways that we can kind of not only just take our mind off of eating all the time or changing our food environment, but also there are ways that we can reduce our appetite quite drastically. So probably one of the biggest things is both psychological and physical. We see that eating a large breakfast appears to reduce total caloric intake in that given day. And the reason is because that breakfast alters the production of specific appetite suppressing molecules for the rest of that day. And a large breakfast decreases the ingestion of calories at lunch and dinner. And on average, although this doesn't always apply to every single person, on average we see that those who eat larger breakfasts have lower body, typically have better metabolic health, and typically eat less calories throughout the day. Probably one of the most important reasons for this is because when we consume food, we get the production of those incretin hormones that decrease appetite. So if we start our day off with a large meal that increases the production of the incretin hormones, we see a less appetitive response throughout the rest of the day. And it's almost as if we don't eat in the morning or we eat small amounts throughout the day. The accumulation of appetite stimulating molecules appears to increase food intake at dinner so much, and then we don't really have that time after the meal to have the incretin response to suppress our appetite because we're going straight to bed. So there's a lot of data to indicate that eating more calories or just larger meals at the beginning of the day may help to reduce body weight by reducing total caloric intake and also increasing energy expenditure throughout the rest of the day.
Sorry, that part right there. See, this is why I might have to put that post back up, but this is why even if calories on paper are equal, you are not eating the same amount of calorie. I mean, you are not in the same caloric balance. So you can be eating, let's just say 1800 calories, both conditions. But at the end of the day, they are not the same calories in the cell. And the reason is because if you are fueling your day, if you are fueling your training, you are going to expend more through the day. And I think people have this idea that calorie deficit, quote unquote, is just what calories you need to eat. But no, it's the calories that come out as well. It's how the calories in impact your calories out. And then how your calories out impact your calories in. It's all intertwined. And then there's the psychology component of it all, which is why this is why we are talking about chronic stress now. This is why we're talking about cortisol, because it's the lifestyle stuff that makes it really difficult to have this cardiometabolic health, to have this situation where things are less sticky, because we tend to make things harder on ourselves by not having these strategies in place that help us regulate our appetite. Because GLP-1, we can do things naturally to support our GLP-1 pathways. We can do things naturally to support our appetite regulation. it takes time, but it's something that will then feed into everything else so that you can stay in a healthier place. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so I guess probably the best place to start is that again, GLP-1 is a molecule that we produce in response to food intake. There's a multitude of dietary factors that increase our natural production of GLP-1. So probably the most important of which being protein, complex carbohydrates, unsaturated fat, and dietary fiber. The reason I say this is because it appears that protein stimulates the greatest release of GLP-1 compared to other macronutrients given the same caloric load. So 500 calories of protein appears to stimulate the production of GLP-1 and suppress appetite more than 500 calories of carbohydrates or fats. We see that there's also an importance of the type of carbohydrates that we're consuming. So the cells that produce GLP-1 are located farther down in the gastrointestinal tract, which means that we need food that is not as easily digestible, that will travel further down the gastrointestinal tract in order to make it to these cells to stimulate the production of GLP-1. So we would prefer to have like a complex carbohydrate rather than a simple carbohydrate. So we might choose to have something such as a fruit rather than, or a potato rather than a potato chip, something like that. So increasing the complex carbohydrates like whole grains, fruits, vegetables, roots, and tubers appears to increase our release of GLP-1 and suppress our appetite. And then we see that dietary fiber can, when it enters into the large intestine and is fermented by the bacteria in our large intestine, these bacteria produce molecules called short-chain fatty acids that can bind to, again, those cells that produce and release GLP-1 and stimulate the release of GLP-1. So a higher dietary fiber intake also increases GLP-1 production. And there is a little bit of evidence, although it's not entirely substantial, so this isn't something that radically change everything, but it appears that unsaturated fats, especially the longer length unsaturated fats, stimulate the release of GLP-1 more than saturated. Again, it probably won't have as meaningful an effect as switching from simple to complex carbohydrates, but there is a minor effect, and it's worth mentioning. And then there's a few other things that increase GLP-1 production, including polyphenols found in fruits and vegetables. So specific ones such as capsaicin and turmeric, and specific polyphenols found in things like green tea and coffee can stimulate GLP-1 release, which is why a lot of those foods and drinks have appetite suppressant effects. And then we see probably kind of the most interesting one ends up being a non-nutritive sweetener called allulose. So allulose is very similar to a stevia, where it's not an artificial sweetener, it's a natural sweetener. It's a 0-calorie sweetener. We can't extract calories from it. But allulose can bind to the cells that produce GLP-1 and increase the production of GLP-1. So in studies where we basically just replace an artificial sweetener with allulose, we see reductions in body weight, food intake, and we see improvements in inflammation and cardiometabolic health. So there's a lot of benefit of allulose. Importantly, it's not as inexpensive as things like Splenda or stevia, and you typically have to use a little bit more, but it's something worth mentioning for those who have the expensive income to utilize allulose maybe in a morning coffee or to sweeten something.
How can I love these practical tips. So I'm going to try to ask a little bit more practical tips in this little section before I move into the next one. Why is blood sugar regulation so important here now? Because we were just talking about ways to support our GLP-1 pathways, which obviously the healthy diet, et cetera, which also comes into play with, okay, so protein and quote unquote good carbs, if that's the best way to call them that way, but good carbs, protein, I'm just gonna say fibrous carbs, there we go. Fibrous carbs, protein, that is all really important in blood sugar regulation, but we're also missing where resistance training also comes into this and how that helps to improve insulin sensitivity. So some more practical tips there and how it kind of intertwines with why muscle is so important here too.
Yeah, so I'd say the regulation of blood glucose in and of itself is an important risk factor for basically all-cause mortality and a multitude of different chronic diseases. So we see that when there's glucose in the bloodstream, it's elevated, especially so. When we talk about blood glucose elevations, we probably want to make a distinction between chronic and acute elevations in blood glucose. So an acute elevation is what happens after a meal. So if I ate a bowl of oats, I would expect my blood glucose to go up to about 140, 150, and then drop back down to normal, which is about 80, 75, or 80. Chronic blood glucose is that baseline blood glucose that you have when you wake up in the morning and in between meals. An individual who is diabetic will have a baseline glucose closer to 110, 120. An individual who is perfectly insulin sensitive or just extremely healthy will have a baseline blood glucose of between 80 and 90. Sometimes a little bit lower, a little bit higher, depending on the individual's genetics. But we see that long-term elevations in blood glucose, which are basically that chronic elevation, not just the acute elevation after a meal, but that chronic elevation in resting blood glucose, that glucose in the bloodstream can impact the functioning of different organs. So glucose can bind to receptors on cells and go through a process called glycation. So it basically alters the functioning of those cells, making them less functional and increasing inflammation. So we see that elevated blood glucose is a risk factor for things such as, well, we know diabetes, but the factors that are the associated symptoms of diabetes, which include numbness and tingling in specific organs, in specific muscles, like your hands and your feet. We see pancreatitis, liver issues, such as fatty liver and liver damage. And we see cardiometabolic issues. So when glucose is in the bloodstream, it can bind to the vascular tissue and it can alter their function, which increases the risk of things like cardiovascular events such as a stroke or a heart attack. So elevated blood. So basically, all of these are side effects of diabetes, which is characterized by elevated blood glucose. And then with resistance training and muscle in and of itself, so not only is muscle a storage for glucose, so it's basically the more muscle we have, the more glucose that we can and source out of bloodstream. The other thing is that when we resist, it stimulates muscle to uptake and utilize more glucose. A bolus of, let's say, a bolus of 100 grams of carbohydrates would enter the bloodstream and leave the bloodstream much more rapidly if that individual had either exercised before or after consuming those carbohydrates. So there's a role of not only having muscle mass in and of itself, but exercising around your carbohydrate ingestion, especially for those who already have prediabetes or diabetes, or just altered insulin sensitivity, poor glucose control. That can help them control their glucose a little bit better as they begin to do all the other strategies that we discussed, such as losing body weight and trying to get to a healthier status. Yeah.
This is another reason why it's kind of powerful to fuel your day, because that is when your body is moving. That is when your body is more likely, if you move your body and you're not sitting down all day, that is, which I would highly recommend. Like, this is why it's so important for you to track your steps. This is why it's so important for you to hit your 10K steps. Well, it's 8 to 12K, I like to say, but it's that movement. This is why walking is something that decreases all-cause mortality, because it is moving your body. It is anti-inflammatory. It is helping regulate blood sugar. It is a helpful thing. And I'm sure that you can explain that a little bit more as well. But going into, you can bring that into the next part as well, but going into practical strategies, again, what exactly is allostatic load? Because I don't think you actually explained allostatic load, how that impacts overall health and ties into insulin resistance, fat storage. I would say particularly around people's bellies, because that's where people start to notice it all, and then they blame it on cortisol, they blame it on stress. So maybe explaining that, and if you can remember, adding on the fact that magnesium, vitamin D, vitamin B deficiency can play a role here, and how you can tie that in, because stress depletes vitamin B, it depletes magnesium, and vitamin D also plays a huge role here. So I don't know whether you can like tie them in together, but I think you can.
Yeah, so allostatic load is basically just take all the stressors you can think of. If you've heard the analogy, you can think of your stress bucket as a rain bucket. And the allostatic load is all of the things entering into, all of the water entering into that rain bucket. And as that bucket begins to fill up, there's a point where the stress becomes overbearing and begins to deteriorate health. So all humans can ache a specific amount of stress, and a certain amount of stress begins to become beneficial. So exercise in and of itself is a stress, and that can benefit the body when that stress is recovered from. So allostatic load is basically how much you are filling up that stress bucket, and when it begins to overflow, that's kind of a symbol of when stress begins to become too much and begins to deteriorate health. So the things that contribute to allostatic load are basically anything that you can think of. So exercise, a caloric deficit, nutrient deficiencies, work stress, life stress, family stress, pretty much anything you can think of can contribute. Stressor that you can think of can contribute to that allostatic load. And as you mentioned, so micronutrients can increase the production of stressful molecules that we are correlate with allostatic load. So nutrient deficiencies, not only from a recovery standpoint, so they impair recovery, so that if you work out the following day, you may not be able to do as much, and that workout in and of itself may be a little bit more stressful, given you have nutrient deficiency. Specific nutrients can have anti-inflammatory effects. They have mild and sometimes quite potent, if you are quite deficient, anti-inflammatory effects. So that in and of itself, the production of inflammatory cytokines contributes to that allostatic load. So there's a lot of things you can do to decrease your allostatic load. Most of them become energy balance. So when an individual has excess body fat, that is also a stressor. So that would contribute to allostatic load if you have excess body fat. So in that individual, a caloric deficit might actually help to decrease allostatic load by reducing body weight. But an individual who's already lean and might be working out quite vigorously, putting them into a caloric deficit may do the opposite and increase allostatic load, because they don't have much body fat to lose. And that energy deficit is impairing their capacity to recover and to cope with any sort of life stressors. So a caloric deficit may increase or decrease stress, overall stress, depending on the person. Exercise in and of itself is a stressor, but oftentimes the stress of exercise ends up blending into recovery that reduces long-term stress and improves our overall functionality. But there's a point in which more exercise does not decrease stress. More exercise to increase stress. That is maybe people that are doing multiple workouts a day or doing quite rigorous cardio. So people that are doing kind of sports training where they're not necessarily thinking about their long-term health, rather how fast and how good they can get at the sport. Oftentimes we see kind of overtraining in the sense that they're training more than they can physically recover from. And then sleep, as most people know, is probably one of the most important things to deal with all stress. And then not only just energy balance, but also micronutrients on a daily basis. And if we are, not only will we not be able to perform specific metabolic processes, but it may hamper our ability to not only think and feel as good as possible, but also our ability to recover pretty much all of our organ systems. And there's specific hormonal milieus that are affected by micronutrients that may once again that allostatin. So there's a reason that we have specific daily values for micronutrients, and it's because they all serve a purpose. And if we are deficient in micronutrients, there's some metabolic process that you may not even know or not even feel that will be altered due to that nutrient deficiency.
This is why, to sum this up, I'm going to kind of mention a few things and then I'll let you tie anything up together, because on the next, we're going to do a part 2 on this for you guys listening to this. And the next part that you listen to is going to be a lot more practically applied stuff. I was going to talk on appetite regulation on this one, but I thought that we would just like explain the hormones, how they all tie together, so that on the next one we can talk more about how to actually get the results that you want in body composition, how to regulate your appetite. It's going to be pretty much tying the bow on this. So it's going to be a nice, shorter, sharper, snappier one that you can walk away with a little bit more confidence to have a shield against bullshit that's out there. But that part that you mentioned on the stress component of all of this, it's almost like once we realize that everything that we do has an impact, everything has a ripple effect. So if you're chronically in this yo, like Calvin mentioned before, plants, protein, that stuff is, if you're eating whole sources of protein, like meat isn't just giving you protein, chicken isn't just giving you protein, eggs, egg whites, dairy, they all have other nutrients and a complex milieu of vitamins, minerals, et cetera, that are beneficial to the body. If you are eating mostly that wholesome diet, you are helping provide yourself with these vitamins and minerals, but it's also what you can absorb. And if you're in this inflammatory state of higher body fat, if your gut health is a mess because you're constantly stressed, if you're over exercising, like Calvin said, and under recovering, these are things that I definitely will be wanting to touch on more next episode as well, because this all stops you from getting out of the hole that you're in, because it's just feeding the negative cycle. And as women, many of us want to just get rid of our body fat straight away. So we keep repeating the cycle of let's chronically diet, let's do more cardio. And then there's the emotional stress, which a lot of us haven't addressed because we're too busy trying to focus on the other dangling carrot. So then we eat more of these quote unquote inflammatory foods. And it's like this pickle where chronic dieting, over exercising, under recovering isn't allowing us to get to a healthy place that we can feel like we're thriving. Is there anything that you can say to that, add to that, explain of that, to sum this up and lead into what you want to talk about in the next one? Now that we have this first episode done, how can we lead this into the next episode? What are we going to talk about? What do you want to leave the listeners with in this episode, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think people underestimate the impact that muscle mass itself has on the way that they look, and especially the way that they feel and function in life. So for some people that I work with, they have almost no worry about what they look like in a sense, but rather they want to be more functional in their everyday life. They want to feel better. And then a lot of people that I work with want to simply just look better. And with looking better oftentimes comes feeling better, but not always. So the impact that muscle has on people's physiques and how they function in their day-to-day life is kind of underestimated and undervalued a lot of times on social media. So I think, but in order to build muscle, we can consistently be in a large caloric deficit, and exercise to a point becomes excessive. So 10 sets of an exercise may not be as good as 15 sets of an exercise over a week, or 50 sets for a muscle group over a week. But 30 sets be less beneficial than 15 sets if all 30 sets are at a sufficient intensity. That's because there's a point in which we simply cannot recover, the muscle cannot recover from a given load that it is provided. And there's a lot of misinformation about how muscle growth works, but the process of muscle growth isn't breaking down a muscle and building it back up. That's simply just a misrepresentation of how muscle growth works. In fact, the process of tearing down a muscle fiber is actually counterintuitive when it comes to trying to build muscle. So although we want to have some sort of stimulus for muscle growth, we're not actually trying to destroy the muscle, or, at a cellular level, we're not trying to actually tear it down, because that ends up being incongruent with our goals of building as much muscle as possible. So I think people think that the more exercise that they do, oftentimes will lead them to better results, whether it's more cardio, more resistance training, more frequency, things like that. But in reality, there's a U-shaped curve for essentially anything, where there's some results as you get higher and higher, and then once you surpass a specific threshold, the results actually begin to deteriorate. So I think trying to find that with exercise and also trying to find that with caloric intake is important, because if we are radically over-exercising and radically under-eating, not only will we be losing muscle, but the percentage of weight that we lose will be in a greater extent muscle than fat. So if I lose 20 pounds in 10 months and you lose 20 pounds in 1 month, the percentage of weight that I lose that comes from fat may end up being greater, and I might lose less muscle mass simply because I took a longer time to do so and I didn't put myself into such a caloric deficit. So there's people think the faster and the more rigorous they do things, oftentimes the better results that they will get. But sometimes simply taking it slower and doing a little bit less may actually lead you to better results in the long term.
I am going to completely scratch the appetite regulation part because you just lit me up. I am like someone who loves talking about the muscle stuff. I didn't know if it was something you could go so deep in. So guys, you're in for a treat next episode. We're going to go deep on how muscle growth works, the balance of stress and recovery, because as you heard on my, I don't even know if it was the last solo podcast, but building muscle is so much harder than losing weight, because most people keep yourselves in a place where muscle loss is probably more likely happening than anything else, because you keep going in this yo-yo diet mentality. So you're never really giving yourself a chance to build muscle. And then when you do the dieting again, you're most likely going to be losing muscle because you're not really understanding how this process works. So I'm excited to talk about that with you next podcast. Is there anything that you want to leave the listeners with? I will say, go and follow Calvin if you want a lot more of the nerdy little snippets, because on Instagram, he puts a lot of, I like the fact that he does a lot of reels. I hardly spend time scrolling Instagram, but whenever I look at your profile, it's really dissecting a lot of myths and explaining things in reality of what the research says. So if you want to find him, his Instagram handle will be down below. It's Calvin_Scheller, which you will know how to spell because it's going to be in the title of this podcast. But otherwise, anything else that you want to leave them with?
No, I think, honestly, I think a lot of things get overcomplicated, but really the best benefits for pretty much health is by getting to a healthy body weight, which is different for everyone, but is typically, within a specific body fat threshold that you can simply just talk to your doctor about. And then exercise is beneficial when you're not doing any, but excess exercise doesn't necessarily come with additional benefits. So finding that sweet spot of exercise, life stress, and trying to maintain a healthy body weight, those are probably the 3 biggest pillars that you can pull to improve your health.
I love that. Be like Goldilocks. And thank you guys for listening to this podcast. If you got any benefit from any of this, please let me know, let Calvin know, share this, and get in for the next episode, where we will be talking things body composition, strength training, and practical strategies to implement into your life, no matter your starting point.